the narrative in our country, of course, we have a war industry in our country, which is the biggest industry. We spend $1.3 trillion a year on national defense and security. And it's an enormous industry. It's not just the people who make arms. It's people who make toilet paper, people who make Tylenol, who are all tied into those military contractors and to the constant wars. So this addiction that we have to war, and as my uncle President Kennedy recognized very early in his term, 2 months into his term of office, the function of the intelligence apparatus in our country, particularly the CIA, is no longer to provide national security to our country, but instead to provide the military-industrial complex with a constant pipeline of new wars. And they're allowed now. They were forbidden for most of history from propagandizing Americans. They did it anyway, but it was illegal. Now, since 2016, they're allowed to. So. We've been given another one of these kind of comic book depictions that, and I'm no friend of Vladimir Putin at all.
I didn't suspect that.
Right.
But you did say that there was almost like a deal, right?
So we're given this comic book depiction that Vladimir Putin is, trying to conquer the world, and he's starting with Ukraine, and that his invasion was utterly unprovoked. But if you look at the history, there was a history of provocations, of U.S. provocations that the top diplomats in our country have been warning against George Kennan, who was the most important diplomat in American history, the architect of the containment policy during World War II and the Cold War, who said, if we move NATO east, we're going to force the Russians into a violent military response. Bill Perry, who was Bill Clinton's, we promised Russia when Gorbachev moved 400,000 troops from East Germany, and we then united Germany under NATO, a hostile army. And he said he wanted one thing before he did that, and we promised that we would not move NATO to the east. And James Baker, who was the Secretary of State under George Bush, famously said, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, since then, we've moved it 1,000 miles to the east, and we've moved it through 14 countries. And Ukraine, from the beginning, was the red line for Russia. Or we put nuclear-capable weapon systems, Aegis missile systems, in Romania and in Poland, right near the Russian border, 12 minutes from Moscow. When the Russians did that in Cuba, my uncle was going to invade them. And worked out a deal at that point with the Russians. The reason they moved their missiles to Cuba is because we put Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. And, my uncle worked out a secret deal with Khrushchev that he'd withdraw if we shut down the Jupiter missile systems in Turkey. So we did these provocations that the Russians continually wanted a peace agreement. And the original peace agreement from 2015 was called the Minsk Accords, which the Russians agreed to, which would have left the Donbass and Lugansk part of Ukraine, but able to protect their Russian ethnic population and the language, and would keep NATO permanently out and guarantee the security of Ukraine. So that was approved by France, it was approved by Germany, and it was approved by Russia. And Zelensky in 2019 campaigned and his one issue, he's an actor and a comedian.
And you told me something funny. You said, I don't have anything against comedians. My wife is comedian, but she wouldn't run for president.
Well, no, the only reason I was saying that, pointing out that he's a comedian, is that the only reason he won is because he was 70% of the vote. Because he promised to sign the Minsk Accords. So the people of Ukraine wanted the Minsk Accords. They wanted peace with Russia. They didn't want war. And then we sabotaged that. We would not let him sign the Minsk Accords. The Victoria Nuland and the neocons in the White House thwarted him, even though he had promised the Ukrainian people to do that. And then the Russians invaded, and they only sent 40,000 troops. Clearly, they did not want to take Kiev, 3.5 million people or whatever. They didn't want to take over the country. They just wanted us to come to the negotiating table. Oh, Zelensky goes to the negotiating table in April of 2022, and he and the Russians initial a peace agreement. And the Russians, in good faith, were withdrawing their troops. And since then, 350,000 Ukrainian kids have died. My son went over there and fought side by side with the Ukrainians against the Russians. We don't know how many Russians have died, but maybe 50,000, 60,000 Russians have died.
It's a big deal. That's a big deal.
And every day it gets harder to settle this. And every day we edge closer to nuclear war or to other, non-conventional wars. We've pushed the Russians into the orbit of the Chinese, which is not a good geopolitical outcome. It's the worst geopolitical outcome. And it's a war that we don't need. In fact, Biden, when he was asked, why are we at war in Ukraine? He said, we're there in order to do regime change in Russia. And his defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, in April of 2022, that our purpose in the Ukraine is to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. And that is the specific mission that the neocons have been writing about since 2002. So that has nothing to do with the Ukraine. Ukraine is a proxy in a geopolitical struggle between Russia and the United States, and all of NATO is being dragged into it, and it's going to destroy NATO. Because ultimately, I don't think NATO, the other NATO countries like Greece, I do not think they have the heart to join a war against Russia. Nobody wants it, and that is going to expose a big weakness in Title V, Section 5 of NATO, which obligates everybody to join.
Yeah.
I think it's weakening NATO. It's exposed the United States as a paper tiger, and it's forced Russia into the orbit of China, and we're now at the edge of nuclear war. It's a bad idea.